Hello, everyone, and welcome to Global Minnesota's Global Conversation for December, where we'll be looking tonight at a report from the Global Climate Summit, sometimes called COP26. You'll be hearing more about that from a group of Minnesotans who were there for that global conversation, that global summit, that global decision-making body, and they'll bring their personal experiences and what they learn, what they see going forward, and what was their thinking, their motivation, their inspiration for going all the way over to Glasgow, Scotland, to be part of that process. I have the honor of serving as president of Global Minnesota, your host for this evening. We're a 70-year-old international organization that works to connect Minnesotans to the world and the world to Minnesota to advance international understanding and engagement. Events at the global level, like the Climate Summit in Glasgow, are exactly the kind of thing that Minnesotans have a history of being part of, creating, organizing, participating. And so this program this evening is part of a long tradition of Minnesotans, and one that Global Minnesota is proud to be associated with and to be part of over the years. We have program partners who are with us on these journeys of global conversations. Climate Generation, the Minneapolis Central Library, Friends of the Hennepin County Library, the Landmark Center. Often, well, not often in the last 2 years, but normally in other times, these events are live in person and streamed and videoed, put in recorded form for future use. We're hopes to go back to in-person events at some point in time, but we really appreciate those partners as well as their contributions to these sessions. And these conversations are often inspired by the Great Decisions program of the U.S. National Foreign Policy Association. That program itself is called the Great Decisions. And they're an over 100-year-old organization that helps local groups throughout the country come together around key global questions, global policy questions. And around Minnesota, there are dozens of organizations from International Falls down to Rochester and all over, of people who come together to look at these topics. Climate and climate crisis and climate change has been a key one. We partner with the Edina Senior Centers, the library at the Washburn Library, the Plymouth Library, the Edina. We partner with different organizations around the country to bring these conversations. Tonight, we'll hear from climate experts, Minnesotans who were there on the scene. Some of you watching tonight probably caught the news or reports, still reports coming out almost every day in the news. So we'll be hearing from folks on the front line who were there. If you would like to ask questions, because we're going to have a round of brief introductions, then we'll have a conversation. You can email those to questions with an S at globalminnesota.org. So questions with an S at globalminnesota.org. Tonight, we're joined by a wonderful group of Minnesotans coming at this from many different angles. Bella Garrioch is the support intern from Climate Generation, which is a Will Steger legacy. She'll be kicking us off this evening. Jessica Hellmann, who's the director and Ecolab chair for environmental leadership at the Institute on the Environment, and that's at the University of Minnesota. Representative Frank Hornstein, Minnesota House of Representatives. Rupali Fatke is the professor of environmental studies at McAllister College. And Ashley Fairbanks, who's the creative director at the 100% campaign. We are still hoping she will join us on this panel as well. So I'm going to hand the microphone over to you, Bella, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much. My name's Bella Garrioch. I'm a third-year student at McAllister College, and I also served as a COP26 support intern and observing delegate during COP26. I think I first learned about COP26 when I was just starting out in college in some classes in my environmental studies major. And I'm really interested in the intersection between climate science and policy. That's even my emphasis within my major. So it seemed to fit really well with my interests. And it was something I wanted to pursue. And I wanted to see if one day I'd be able to go, because I knew that it was a couple of years away. This one was particularly interesting to me as well because my whole family is Scottish. I'm a Scottish citizen. And so going to Glasgow was a dream come true for me because it was like everything was lining up with my academics and my family and something I'm really passionate about. So I worked really hard to try and find some opportunity for me to be able to go, and things kept falling through. COVID restrictions made it really difficult. But through a lot of support from my professors at Macalester, I managed to find Climate Generation, and they were looking for someone to help them remotely with sending other delegates to COP26. And so that was how I thought my contribution would go. And I was really excited to just do that. But then only about 3 weeks before it happened, there was suddenly an opening for another person to go in person. And I took it, and it was a really amazing experience. It was everything I imagined it would be. It was an amazing trip for my personal independence and my education. I feel like I'm taking a lot back with me to school. And it really felt like the beginning of my career because I really would like to be able to work within climate science and policy one day. And that's something that I'm pursuing. So it was truly amazing to be able to be given that opportunity. And I did a lot of writing while I was there. Since I've come back, I've done speaking with a lot of different people about what exactly was happening. And I was very passionate about keeping the hope up because a lot of people in media were being very negative. And I wanted people back here in Minnesota to be able to see what it was really like there because I saw a lot of hopeful talk from people who were really there on the ground. Yeah, that's my introduction. With that, I'll pass it to Jessica Hellmann.
Thank you so much, Bella. It's exciting to hear your story and your experiences. I'm eager to hear more about it. Hi, everybody. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm Jessica Hellmann. I'm the director of the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota. And I have to be completely clear and transparent. I did not attend this year's Conference of the Parties in Glasgow, or what we call COP for short. I have attended COPs in the past, most notably the Paris meeting in 2015, where the Paris Agreement was signed. But in my research and teaching over the last 25 years, all of that has focused on climate change impacts, climate change adaptation, and ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Most recently, some colleagues and I at the U were asked to host the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is a collaboration with the US Geological Survey and 6 other educational and natural resource management organizations. So, needless to say, I follow climate science, climate policy, and the Conference of the Parties very closely. But I'm also here tonight to share experiences from U of M colleagues that we did send to Glasgow this year. The institute that I run is responsible for distributing the Conference of the Parties observer badges across the U of M. And initially we received 6 badges from the United Nations, and those badges, those 6 can be converted into 12 attendees. And we needed to spread those across a university community of 50,000 potential participants. Fortunately, St. John's and St. Ben's and the University of Miami were kind enough to share some of their badges with us so that the U was able to send a total of 28 participants to Glasgow. Still 28 of 50,000, it's a very select few. And because so few can attend, we send researchers, educators, and students who are working directly on climate issues and climate policy. And each attendee had to explain in an application why that experience would be valuable to their work or their studies or their professional development. Several of our participants, like Bella described, blogged about their experiences, and you can find that in the sustainability education section of the Institute on the Environment website. And they also Zoomed back home during the meeting to share their experiences with members of the U of M community. And I'm just going to mention really quickly, of course, everyone had individual opinions and experiences, but there were certainly some common themes that I'm excited to talk with you all about this evening. And I know we're going to talk a lot more about this as a group in a moment. But just briefly, there are 3 observations I heard from the U of M participants really loud and clear. First, they felt and they were excited to be part of a successful meeting. The effort of the Conference of the Parties continues on, and the world is still committed to the Paris Agreement. But this is definitely a case of the glass being both half empty and at the same time half full. And we can talk more about what that means. Second, our participants report that the meeting had a real sense of urgency about it that was even greater than at the Paris meeting, which was another pivotal Conference of the Parties. And that's because the time horizon for action is increasingly short, and every moment, literally every year between these conferences, really counts. And third, there were a number of important announcements and commitments made in Glasgow, like phasing out coal and reducing methane emissions. But there were other key issues that were left over from Paris that weren't addressed, including a financing target of $100 billion per year. And like much of the world, many of our participants were disappointed with this omission. But thanks to great media coverage and lots of online content, you didn't have to be there to be part of the COP community this year. And personally, I'm really grateful to see the meeting become more accessible to those who didn't travel. And lastly, in a shout out to next year's meeting, COP27, which will be in Egypt, and many are calling Africa's COP. That's an occasion we at the U are eagerly anticipating, both for the folks who will be able to send in person and those of us who will participate virtually. So I'm grateful to be here and looking forward to the conversation. And it is my pleasure to turn the mic over to Minnesota House Representative Frank Hornstein. Please take it away, Frank.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you to Global Minnesota for organizing this wonderful event. This was the first time I had attended a COP, a Conference of Parties. I had certainly observed them over many years of being both an environmental organizer and a member of the Minnesota House of Representatives since 2002. Climate change has been one of my highest legislative priorities. And as chair of the Transportation Committee, I had a particular interest in this COP because transportation has now eclipsed all other sources of greenhouse gas emissions as not only the largest, but among the fastest growing. And so I wanted to connect with people on a policy level, but also an activist level. With my organizing background, I felt that really connecting with organizers from around the world was very important, and being a part of some of the really energetic and important activity outside of the COP was critical. One of my takeaways is that there were really 2 COPs, right? Conferences of Parties. One was what took place outside of the venue, in the streets of Glasgow, in a very well-attended conference called the People's Summit. And among the activists and organizers that were assembled, that, as Jessica pointed out, did feel that incredible sense of urgency. And that's one of the reasons I chose to go to Glasgow, because this really is a critical turning point. And I wanted to see very strong and bold action taken at that conference. And so the second COP was the more official COP, the negotiations, the pavilions. I had observer status from an organization called Citizens Climate International, which I'm very appreciative of. And so there was a lot of activity on the inside, workshops, different organizations. Some of it was critiqued as greenwashing, I think, very validly. Nuclear power advocates running around with T-shirts saying, "Ask me about nuclear," and others. But that was very valuable as well. And some of us in Minnesota participated in a workshop inside the COP on line 3, for example. And so I'll just simply say that among the experiences that were most meaningful to me were meeting these activists from around the world. And you could just do it in the hallways, you could do it outside the venue. I did, one of the more meaningful moments for me came in a park in Glasgow when I was just relaxing on a very warm and sunny afternoon, warm for Scotland, I think it was in the 50s, and waiting for my next meeting. And I came upon a group of activists that were memorializing environmentalists who had been killed around the world for their organizing activities. I was aware of this issue, but I didn't realize that there was an organizing effort to defend those activists, a group called Not One More, London-based organization. So I connected with them. And I connected with an organization called Gaia, the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, met people working on zero waste from Tunisia and Ghana and Belgium. And of course, our own Indigenous Environmental Network was well represented. It's a Bemidji-based organization, and they were calling attention to the fact that Indigenous groups and people from the Global South were not as well represented as they should have been at the COP. So those experiences were particularly meaningful. And I come back very energized and very excited about the transportation provisions in the Infrastructure Act that was just passed that do have very important climate provisions that we can talk about in the Minnesota House of Representatives. So that's just an overview of some of the experiences I had. And I'm very, very excited now to pass it over to Dr. Rupali Fatke, who is the chair of the Environmental Studies Department at my alma mater, Macalester College, where I was an environmental studies major. So thank you very much, Dr. Fatke.
Good evening, everyone. Well, we are well represented here among the panelists. Thanks, Frank, for that introduction. It's really lovely to be here among friends and colleagues. As Frank introduced me, I'm a professor in environmental studies at Macalester. I'm trained as a political scientist, and I've been at the college for 17 years, where my research and teaching focus on environmental policy and climate policy, as well as on energy issues. I've had the privilege of leading our COP delegation now for several years. Like Jessica, this was not my first time at the UN Climate Summit. In fact, I think Jessica and I were there together in 2015 in Paris. I also had the privilege of being in Bonn in 2017 and now in Glasgow this past year. And so one of the things I've been reflecting on is how these experiences have been so very different from one another. They also really reflect how climate diplomacy has changed over the last decade. And at Paris, it was monumental to have world leaders there able to make up for the failures of several past COPs and able to hammer out the Paris Accords with a focus on countries arriving with their nationally determined contributions. The ambition originally for Paris was actually to hold the planet to 2 degrees. And after much negotiation, 1.5 sort of remained in the Paris Treaty. As I think back to my experience being in Bonn in 2017, it was really striking because this was during the Trump administration when the US had, famously pulled out of the Paris Accords, and where there was no official US presence. There were Americans there representing states and cities and others from the private sector, but really there was no official presence. And that was really, the silence was deafening for attendees, and really the US presence was very much missing, and maybe at that point not even welcome. Now, leading into Glasgow, there was a lot of interest in this meeting because it was the time when the Paris Rulebook, finalizing the rules for the implementation of the Paris Treaty would happen. And I have to say, it was really impressive to see the US all in, which is the phrase the Biden administration was using, a very strong presence of administration staff. I think at one point I saw the number of 17 heads of federal agencies were present over the 2-week period. I saw the EPA administrator, the Transportation Secretary, Health and Human Services, the Department of Interior. They were all present there, and that was an important face that the administration was putting on, and also many members of Congress. And it was really impressive to see John Kerry in action, and also Gina McCarthy in trying to bring the negotiations to a successful close. So that very much made an impression on me, particularly since the last meeting. I also want to say that this is the 3rd time that I've been at a COP with a really strong Minnesota delegation. And I think this is really important. We've talked about the importance of the Midwest and the importance in terms of the level of emissions that come from our region. And being part of a Minnesota delegation, I think, is really powerful because we get to not only share our messaging, but our observations, our resources, and come back and reflect together on the work we want to do at home. Just a few more takeaways I'll share now. I know we'll talk more about it. So as I think across the last 3 climate summits that I've had a chance to participate in, I know the stakes have really changed. We are not debating the science any longer. And at no point at this COP did I feel that the science was being questioned. It was very clear that 1.5 degrees is the only solution. And also the ramifications of not meeting that target were also made very clear by the scientists who were there. The second takeaway is that I have very much begun to wonder if the United Nations may not be the most important, useful, successful instrument for climate diplomacy any longer. Maybe this is something we can talk about tonight. We see the authority of the UN start to erode over this last decade. And I have begun to wonder if some of these negotiations need to be moved to different venues where the economics of climate change are really front and central, because that's what we're talking about at this point. It's not the science any longer. And then finally, I really left this meeting feeling that Indigenous leaders and youth activists had really arrived on the scene. They were the ones putting the most pressure on delegates to have a successful COP, to hold true to the ambitions of this meeting. It's also interesting to see climate negotiators become much younger, right? I had a chance to talk to members of the Panama delegation, and we heard that their average age of a climate negotiator for Panama was 27, I think it was. So these are youth activists who have turned into climate negotiators. And similarly, the presence of Indigenous leaders was very strong. And we saw that even including those from Minnesota. So I'll leave it at that. I know we are also thinking about COP27, which will be in Egypt. And I am thinking about how to rally our Minnesota delegates and think about what our message will be next year. I think with that, I am turning it back to our moderator.
Thank you so much to all of you for sharing those experiences, but also for your insights, both how you came to want to participate, your participation in the past, but also looking ahead. And Rupali, it was very important to hear your evaluation. You're asking, is this the right format? Are there other places where this diplomacy should be going? So I want to invite all of the speakers to unmute yourself. Join me here on the screen. And I want to ask a question. And maybe not all will want to answer this, but I'm wondering what you told your loved ones, maybe your children, maybe your parents, maybe anybody, but what did you tell somebody you really cared about and their future about how you felt when you came back, or maybe while you were there? Jump in.
Well, Mark, thank you for that question. I guess, you know, it's a little about what I said at the beginning, that to me, there were so many important moments, but I think back on, you know, a couple of the marches that a number of us participated in. And I appreciated that Dr. Fatke talked about the youth and Indigenous-led nature of a lot of the activism that was taking place. And so there was a youth and Indigenous-led march on Friday, and a very large one on the Saturday in the middle of the conference period. And you know, it's 150,000 people in the streets of Glasgow. It was very, very inspiring. And many of them were youth. I just, you know, I remembered the next day seeing the headlines of some of the Scottish newspapers, and I immediately sent that we have a family text thread, Mark. And so that was what I immediately sent, pictures of the march and those Scottish newspaper headlines, because it was very inspiring and very hopeful. And I do think that some of the changes, some of the success stories from inside the COP really were made possible by the fact that there was pressure from the outside, that there was a social movement that was really capturing the urgency of the moment.
Great. Others?
As I mentioned at the beginning of my intro, all of my family is Scottish. And this was actually a really great opportunity to see them for the first time since COVID started. So I hadn't seen most of my family over there for a little over 2 years. So a lot of the time, and of course, everyone fled to me to try and see me because I had made it all the way over there. And so I saw my aunt and my grandmother and my uncle. And most of the time when I was talking to them, I was just going, oh my God, you're not going to believe what I did today. And I would just go into heavy detail about every single person that I saw, every interesting thing that I listened to. I had to do a lot of explaining of what COP was because I have a lot of family members who live in very rural parts of the country who didn't even really know what I was doing there. So there was a lot of explaining. And then whenever I called back to the US where my parents and brother are, it was more of that kind of I felt like I was overflowing with excitement and just needed to talk about every single thing that I was doing. So there was a lot of just me needing to almost process my own thoughts through other people. So that was me talking to my family.
Fabulous.
I can add to that. I have to say, I think what I was saying to my family in the beginning was the world exists outside of the US. I mean, this was my first time leaving the country and stepping off that plane and being in the UK and just sort of pausing and thinking, okay, this is stepping a step back into the world for us personally, as well as us as a country. And so it really kind of took my breath away, leaving the United States and then all of a sudden being in this incredible melting pot of people from 200 countries and just remembering the breadth of our human experience when it comes to climate change. But similarly to that, I think I came away reminded about how very, very hard this work is. And the UNFCCC, the climate negotiations are based on a consensus model, and consensus among almost 200 countries is exceptionally hard. Every single word is understood differently depending on your political context, the culture of your nation, the delegation that's representing that country. All of those things are negotiated on the floor. It's not just the language. And so it's a reminder about how difficult consensus is. And I think I came back and was sharing with my students, and it's really hard when you're working in a Google document and there's 5 of you. Well, just imagine when that Google document is a treaty and there's 200 countries and 100 different languages present. And that's the reality of these kinds of negotiations.
Great.
I was in one of those classes where we heard about that.
I'm asking this question partly from the point of view of how much excitement I heard in your voices, and being able to transmit an international process, whatever it is, so that others can be excited and think about. You're mentioning the next one in Egypt and the one after that in the United Arab Emirates. So you're going to have 2 in the MENA district, the Middle East and North Africa. What about the process of thinking through and preparing and working with your friends and colleagues? Would somebody today, if they said, I'm inspired by what I'm hearing, I want to see if I can figure out how to get to Egypt, but maybe I'll go see the pyramids at the same time, what kind of advice would you have in terms of preparing and being really prepared to be as effective as possible a year from now in Egypt? Jessica, you've been to a few of these.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know if we've emphasized enough, right? So Glasgow was COP26. So next year will be COP27, 28, and so on. I mean, they continue, as Rupali said, it's very hard work. It's an extended deliberative process. We're going on a journey. There are issues or approaches to be addressed each particular year. But one of the things that strikes me, we tend to talk about what happened this year. But if you look at some of our students, really, Rupali was talking about her students, I think about a typical undergraduate, we're talking about COP26, 27, that's an entire lifespan, right? I don't know, Bella, maybe you would feel this way. I'm not sure exactly how old you are, but for those of us who follow them sort of year to year, and we can see how challenging it is, that's that's the nature of the work that needs to be done. And you see the progress that's being made. That's the glass is half full. But the glass is half empty that, my goodness, how much does it take? How long do we need to deliberate year after year after year? So yes, great things will be done next year. It will be very important, as Representative Hornstein was talking about, the significance of the global South, this imbalance of the countries that are responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions and the disproportionate impacts that we felt in poorer countries. Of course, we feel lots of impacts here in wealthy countries too. That issue remains and is a predominant one and will be a focal point when the meeting is in Egypt, I'm sure.
I can add
Go
to
ahead,
what
please.
Jessica said about this. And I think if you are interested in attending a future COP, you could certainly reach out to some of us and we can describe the process for getting yourself added to a delegation. And there's a lot of lead time. We plan for this almost a year in advance in many cases. I think it's important to know some of the complex history of this institution. COP refers to Conference of the Parties. And so it's an annual meeting of the parties that are signatory to a treaty. So it's an unusual kind of institution that is housed within the United Nations. So understanding some of that complex history is important. But I also think knowing your own story, why is this important to you? What do you have to give and to gain from an experience like this is equally important. This next COP27 will be very interesting to watch because, and we sort of heard this through the halls in Glasgow, what is Africa and what is Egypt in Africa? For many, Egypt is really a part of the Middle East and not part of the African identity. And so there's some very interesting national, regional politics at work in Egypt hosting this meeting. And then also, where is Egypt in its own climate journey, in its own journey of using fossil fuels? And these COPs are kind of like hosting an Olympic game, right? There's a lot of preparatory work that happens to clear the streets and to green your image and to set a mission forward for your country. I think that's really it's challenging for every country. I think it's particularly challenging for Egypt during a decade of waves of populism, nationalism, calls for decolonization and so on. So all of that's going to come together as this next COP is organized.
I wanted to also just give a shout out to Climate Generation, if there's folks on the call, because they and Fresh Energy and a number of groups did a lot of prep work, not only with people who are going, but sort of the broader community ahead of Glasgow. And this was my first conference, and I found that preparatory work very, very valuable. And I want to echo what was said earlier, that this is something that anyone, you can go as an observer. You have to go with a group that has, was described earlier, observer badges. Groups get a certain number of them. But we had academic institutions, nonprofit organizations, public entities, others, were all, welcomed at this event. And so if you have an interest, I think people on this panel could potentially direct you to different organizations in Minnesota that may have access to the observer status. But again, I think the prep work that went into it, the phone calls, the Zoom calls, really, really helpful. And so thanks again to Climate Generation for really taking the lead on that.
And Mark, what you guys are doing in Global Minnesota is also incredibly important, right? We can't all go. And we shouldn't all go. I mean, we need a representative portion of the global community, including observers who are there to tell a job of observers is to come and tell the story, to be representatives of the global community, from academia to NGOs to government and whatnot. But we do have to come back and we have to talk about it. We have to carry forward the work that's done between the meetings on behalf of the global community. Fortunately, there's a lot more coverage of these meetings now than there ever used to be. So it's also easier for us to engage in those conversations.
And did you find that the coverage that you were seeing in the Minnesota media relatively speaking, reflected the reality you were experiencing, either following it closely like yourself, Jessica, or from others who were there? You know how sometimes you're in something and then you read about it in the paper and you go, wait a minute, that doesn't sound like what I experienced. What about our coverage here? Did it match what you were feeling, learning, seeing there in Glasgow or in the online version of Glasgow?
I would say yes and no. You know, it's really interesting when you get to participate in events that are making history in front of your eyes. And so I remember, for example, sitting in the session where President Obama was speaking. And then like seconds later, right, seeing the tweets and the stories coming up in the news, and you're watching this thing unfold in front of you and then feeling challenged by the reporting of that. Because I think in general, the reporting from the beginning was to call the conference a failure before it had really gotten started. And that's sensationalizing, and it draws people in, is provocative, but I think it does pull the rug from underneath the work that people are trying to accomplish. And so for me, it was somewhat disappointing in the first few days of the conference for it already to be called a failure, for example. I think that it is really fascinating watching the foreign journalists at work too, and seeing the different cultures of journalism that exist in the world and are side by side and for these meetings. So sometimes we were relying on the global press, even though we were in the room, because they had access to documents ahead of time and really important interviews that even as an observer you did not. So it was interesting pull and tug.
I wonder if anything that you experienced or any decisions that came has made you fundamentally alter your strategy, your thinking about tactics, your field of vision, your hopes and dreams for the future. Did this conference of the party have an effect that changed somewhat fundamentally? Because you're all kind of activists. You make the world better people in an active way. Anything fundamental happen as a result of you being part of this process?
Well, for me, Mark, it just reinforced a lot of, some of my own values and beliefs in terms of my role as a public official. I think it helped underscore the urgency of the matter, which again, that was one of the reasons I went, because I felt this COP was particularly, as Jessica said, historic in many ways. But I think just to reinforce the urgency, and that is playing out now. We did a hearing yesterday in the Minnesota House of Representatives on the federal infrastructure bill, which really is important for the climate. We've had many examples, well, not many, but a couple of major examples in the last 100 years of federal infrastructure bills, the Green New Deal, the Highway Bill in 1956. This is up there with that. But it also has really important climate provisions. We're going to have $68 million in this bill for electric vehicle infrastructure in the state of Minnesota. And so, that development, and that bill was signed while we were in Glasgow. And so, that development coming on the heels of this conference, I think is a hopeful sign. But it's really going to be up to all of us to make sure that not only are the goals of Glasgow understood, but that we at the local level take steps to make sure we get down to 1.5 degrees. There is that saying, all politics is local. And so I think I trust there are people who are at that event in a public and official capacity, or as observers or others, that are going back to their local communities and really figuring out how do we, from a public policy standpoint in our local communities, get down to that goal that we need in order to stave off climate catastrophe. And so I go back with a real sense of urgency, but also hope that at least we have this tool in the United States to work with.
So, Mark, can I hit that point a little?
Please,
more?
yes.
And then I want to hear the answer to your question, that Bella's response too. But just for the purposes of, like Rupali was talking about, the arc of this these Conference of the Parties, their annual meetings of the parties who are signatories to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. What Representative Hornstein is saying about the responsibility that the meetings serve as an inspiration to come back and do national and subnational work, whether that be policy work or other kinds of, there's a lot of participation in the private sector as well in these activities. The current version of the international agreements are designed to emphasize that that's where the real work actually happens. When the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change started in the first several rounds of Conference of the Parties, culminating in the Kyoto meetings, which were COP7, I think, there was a Kyoto protocol that came about, and that had binding targets. So as we lived in the era of the Kyoto protocol, which the UN was never an official signatory to the protocol, even though it was a signatory to the overall convention, that we learned from that experience that the binding targets were not, didn't seem to hold the whole world together, as the United States was stellar, the prime example. So the framework shifted from one of binding targets to one of shared commitments. So the Paris Agreement set a temperature target and invites countries to make voluntary commitments to achieving that collective target. And then essentially the Conference of the Parties is about reporting, is about committing, reporting, taking action, and frankly, kind of global shaming, right? It's about, it's the publicity and the interaction, the international interaction about how serious each country is to taking action. That's the primary influence of the international negotiations now. So when Representative Hornstein says he has a commitment to come back home and take action, that's actually how the whole thing works in many respects.
That seems like a fundamental shift over time. Sometimes maybe I hear this phrase, governance by goals. We set a kind of goal. We want to get to X number of people vaccinated. We want to get to X amount of green, but it feels like that's been an evolution that's been assisted by the fact that when governments do make public statements, and we have the electronic digital tools to help us monitor, to follow, to, again, let's say, get behind the curtain and to communicate around the planet, there are new tools for transparency that then makes there be more conversations about walking the talk, or you promised this, or you made this commitment, how's it going? Is that a strategy that is evolving in new ways? Did this COP26 feel like an affirmation of that strategy? Did it feel like that strategy is fraying? And how did it feel for those of you watching it closely or inside of it?
I feel like this touches on something that we've already been talking about, which is language. This was something I was focusing on a lot when I was there, was the different, you'd walk into these different sessions versus side events versus all kinds of other things. And the way that people speak about these issues was totally different. And so I remember there were some events that I went to that were very human focused, talking about, I remember going to one panel that was in the big hall that had all the pavilions talking about Indigenous people and Black coal. And that was very community oriented. The language was very simple. People were trying to get this message out there, just saying these people matter, this issue matters. And then I walk into a plenary session about phasing out coal, and suddenly there's all this messaging that's very jargon heavy, very specific to the industry. And luckily I've had some training in my degree so far so that I was able to understand that, but I felt like that was a big thing with sending that message out there to other people. And I think to more touch on your question, I feel like there was also a lot of posturing that was happening through that. And I was just finding that these, different countries would use different language to talk about what they were doing. And like I said, some people were being a lot more jargon heavy and talking about these very specific things that are very vague and not very tangible to people. And then other, generally smaller, generally the ones being more impacted more quickly, or had this sense of urgency, had a very different kind of tone when they were talking about it. And so that was something I was really focusing on while I was there. And you could just, I would say there were differences everywhere. And sometimes it felt like there was not that kind, it took a lot to then find a unifying voice that was then going to say, this is what the conference is saying, and this is what international bodies are saying about these issues.
Great observation.
Yeah, add to that, it's so amazing watching the persuasive politics at work, the intercultural work that's going on among delegations. And while we're focused on this being a global event and global governance and countries arriving with their commitments, of course, there's so much bilateral work going on, particularly, the US, between the US and China, the US and Brazil. During week 2, there was a sort of surprise bilateral agreement. I don't think it was that much of a surprise between the US and China that sort of helped move the ball in the final days. But also all these sort of regional coalitions, these multilateral pieces like the post-coal coalition that Bella was just mentioning, that maybe half the parties were signatories to, but not the other half. And so then it allows us to shine the light on those who are missing and absent and why. So there's so many, it's really multi-scalar governance going on. And so there are people who are paying attention to all of these moving parts because they come together to form that agreement.
So when you think about next year, the year after that, that longer term perspective, how do you imagine that we tie together our local work, our state work here with those who are thinking about those moving parts at that global level so that we make the maximum contribution next year and the year after and the year after, conscious that we're part of a global, one family, one globe?
Well, Mark, I think it's so appropriate that Global Minnesota sponsor this because, again, of many takeaways, I think just the importance of just global citizenship really shines through. And, when Jessica had mentioned that, or maybe it was you, Mark, that, we're in Egypt next year and then the United Arab Emirates after that. And, shortly after, the COP ended in Glasgow, there was not a treaty, but a notice of intent signed between Israel and Jordan under the auspices of the UAE and the United States that it's part of what's known at the grassroots level as a green-blue deal. Green is renewable energy that Jordan will be selling to Israel as solar energy, and then Israel will be getting Jordan desalinated water. Now, this is like a climate justice issue. And that happened because of grassroots activism in Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. And then it was translated to the international stage in the form of this agreement that took place in Dubai just a couple weeks after Glasgow ended. So we are now going to be focusing on a region of the world that is both suffering from climate change, refugee issues, in Syria, in part caused not just by war, but by a climate drought issues there. And it's also a part of the world where many fossil fuels are produced and exported. And so what the example I'm sharing with you is something that's happened among different people in different countries at the grassroots level, then translated into high-level international diplomacy. That's a model that has to take place and is taking place in some regards are all around the world. And we need to understand those movements, those global movements, and support them.
Mark, also, I couldn't agree more about the global understanding that we are a citizen of the world and we have connections elsewhere, we also have we have special responsibility. Depending on how you do the math, if you consider if the Midwestern US were a country, it would be in the top 10, like number 7 of global emitters. So it's not just that we're being there to be connected with other countries and be nice and play our part. We actually have disproportionate impact. Now, the flip side of that is we have a lot of opportunity to drive economic development and lots of other really transformative things that can help our economy. And there's a lot of transformation happening around greenhouse gas emission reduction, a lot of economic markets to be part of, and we want to be part of those so that we can also share in the wealth that can be associated with productively moving to a carbon neutral society. But it's not just part of the whole, we have some special obligations.
Amen. We're getting near the time we have set for tonight's conversation, which is obviously just the beginning. I want to make sure that we have time for each of you to make some closing comments. And if you want to reference where people can read more of your material or go to your website or, that kind of thing. But for me, the thing that I've been hearing that's inspiring me is how your being there or being deeply involved was complex and conflicted and difficult and all of that, and incredibly inspiring, energizing, and feeling like progress was being made. That's pretty good in the time of COVID. It's much better than the newspapers told me. I wasn't following it in the way that you were. It is a reminder of other things, and thank you, Representative Hornstein, for reminding us of other things that we've done in our lives that were energizing in that same sort of way. But it also says to me that ultimately, these are moments for lifting up special agreements, special things, special coverage, special opportunities. But the real work is back home, in the street, in the media, in the public, to both prepare the groundwork for making a change. You mentioned, Jessica, about our region's contribution to this problem. We got real work to do. Frank mentioned money that could help really boost the infrastructure for carbon-free cars and that sort of thing. But we also then have the responsibility in our own lives and in the lives of our families and friends to be talking to and bringing others into this discussion. So tonight is an opportunity, and it was so fun to have these different perspectives and people coming from different angles. But I know this is just one of those steps in that public conversation. It's one of the opportunities to connect, and it's one of the opportunities to get a little piece of the inspiration that you all got and to help pass that on to the folks who are watching and participating in this way tonight. So I want to maybe walk this backwards for any final comments. Representative Hornstein, you're at the bottom of my gallery view.
Well, again, thank you so much, Mark, and thank you to Global Minnesota and all of these wonderful, incredible panelists that I get inspiration from. And I'll just echo what you said, Mark, in your just last comment. I mean, we have lots of work to do, and the progress that we can make at the national level, at the state level, locally, in a UN conference, that progress is proportional to the amount of grassroots activism and involvement and engagement from a lot of different people. That national infrastructure bill, would never have happened without just a groundswell of work on climate issues. And of course, we could potentially have even more climate support in this Build Back Better bill, which is pending. So, activism and organizing does make a difference, and it makes a difference in international deliberative bodies, as well as those in our own country at every level of government. And of course, Jessica had mentioned the private sector and nonprofits, of course, have such a huge role to play. So active citizenship, we've got to continue on with that. We've got to continue to build this global climate justice movement, increasingly led by youth and indigenous voices, and continue our work together for environmental justice.
Bella.
Thanks. I also really want to thank you for having me here, because this whole thing has been just an amazing opportunity for me. And I know that that's kind of a selfish thing to think about when you're trying to talk about international problems. But for me, this was huge. And something that Jessica said that really spoke to me was that whole, people who've never gone to a COP before are seeing it one way, and people who've been watching for 26 years are thinking a very different thing. I'm only 20. This was my first COP. So to me, when I was there, it was just all overwhelming and just a lot of learning for me personally. And then it took a lot of reflection afterwards to try and put this back in the context of the rest of the world and this issue that I am very passionate about and hope to dedicate the rest of my life to. And so, yeah, I think I had a little bit of an odd perspective on it, just because it felt like this was a big moment for me, and also just sort of the beginning for me, even though I know that it hasn't been the beginning for a lot of other people. So there are more people who are coming into this fight and coming in to work on all this. And that's why I try to be hopeful as much as possible when I talk about it.
Great, thank you. Rupali.
That was lovely to hear, Bella. These experiences would be so much more lonely if we didn't have such a dynamic Minnesota group that organizes before, that supports each other during, and then comes back to share. And we've been doing so for the last month, it seems, very regularly in writing and in presentations and informally. So it would be really hard to be one among 20,000. It's so much more rewarding to be one among 60 who are there together to greet the world. The couple of other takeaways I'll leave you with tonight, and I've been thinking about them through the course of our conversation. The first is there's a lot of contradictions in the work that we do. There's contradictions in the climate justice we advocate for as a country and the things that we come back and do through our domestic policy. And similarly in Minnesota, we want to put the best face on this and talk about all of the progressive work we're doing on climate and energy. But at the same time, we are still, investing in tar sands pipelines and making decisions that can feel like they are taking us quickly in the opposite direction. So I think we have to hold those contradictions in front of us and really think about them, because it sometimes doesn't feel like we are moving in the right direction with momentum, right? It seems like there's a lot of backwards and forwards, and we just simply don't have time for that. But also, I want to emphasize that when we talk about solutions, and this is so much the focus of COP, they can often feel like they're technological solutions. We talk about the infrastructure bill, we talk about EV recharging, more solar panels, all of this technological work. There's a lot of social innovation that needs to happen too. There's a lot of innovation in how we publicly engage in this decision making, how we build new cultures around climate justice. And so I would hope that we are investing as much in the social work as well as the technological work that we're doing, because the technologies on their own never deliver, right? It doesn't help to build a green highway if it's built on the same principles of every other highway we've ever built. So that's something that's really at the forefront of my mind.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jessica.
I love this idea of contradictions. I think just looking at the Glasgow meeting as both a glass half full and a glass half empty, and having both of those things be true. And Bella still being able to say that she has hope. I mean, what we need hope. We also just need action, and we need to continue to make progress. I love how Rupali acknowledges, sure, there's a technological piece, there's social innovation, there's new norms, new aspiration that we need to take on as a society. I really like to, and I'm also so inspired. Bella says she would like to dedicate her life to this. I know Rupali and I wake up every morning thinking about these things. But you don't have to, Bella, you do have to dedicate your life to it, but everyone else, you don't have to dedicate your life to this. What we'd like for people to do is to be educated, to become educated and be interested in this issue. There are I like to say 3 gases, 3 sectors. Here in the US and in Minnesota, there are 3 predominant greenhouse gases that we need to focus on: methane, nitrous oxide, and CO2. And there are 3 sectors in which those greenhouse gases tend to appear, broadly speaking: transportation, electricity generation, and agriculture. And if you think about all of the ways and places that as a consumer, as a voter, as a neighbor, you can engage with those gases in those sectors, there's lots of work to be done, and you don't have to go to Glasgow or to Egypt to make a difference and be part of that global community. So thank you, Mark. I agree with my fellow panelists. It's a privilege to be able to talk about these ideas with you and everyone else who's motivated to have an impact on this topic.
Well, thank you to all of you for both inspiring us, bringing some of that inspiration in, but also giving us some wisdom about how we think about our own, what we can do and the possibilities moving ahead. It's really important to know this arc. This is a long-term thing, but it also is tomorrow morning when we get up and going on from there. Tonight's discussion is really important, and it is recorded and it will be archived on the YouTube channel for Global Minnesota. It always takes a couple days, but I want everybody to know that it's going to be there and available. There have been a number of other programs on climate at different times, often right before a COP, sometimes after. But there's a number of other topics and other opportunities in that same archive. So be sure to take a look at it. I want to thank especially our members of Global Minnesota. It's your membership contributions that make it possible to do these free programs. They get broadcast around the world. There'll be people watching this from all over the planet. And for those of you who would like to become members, we would love that. And this is the month when we have the generosity of a family foundation that's matching up to $50,000, all of the contributions, the end of the year gifts and memberships and all of that. So now's the time to jump in if you care to. We really need your support to be able to keep raising these issues in the broadest possible ways and bringing these voices into our community. It's our partners, our members, our partners in the community that make this happen, but it's the work of our leaders and our spokespeople, like we had tonight on this panel, that keep us all informed, moving ahead, and inspired. And want to underline that line of hope. Bella, thank you for bringing us that hope. And to all of our panelists, thank you for inspiring us. And we look forward to the next conversation and the next conversation and the next conversation, and to the action that's needed to bring this into a new future. Thanks again to everyone, and good night to our audience. Good morning to our friends that are in Asia, and good late night to our friends in Europe who tuned in this evening. Goodbye now.
Thank you. Good night.